Hello and welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Jackson, and it's my mission to share the science of human behaviour in a practical, fun and inspiring way. In each podcast episode, I interview an expert from the fields of psychology, well-being, leadership, parenting or high performance. I pick their brain to uncover what they know about living well, what tips do they have for you and I quiz them about how they apply their expertise in their own life. Join me as we discover simple, science-backed ways to live, learn, flourish, and fulfill your potential. Hello and welcome back to the Potential Psychology Podcast, or welcome if this is your first time listening. I am your host, Ellen Jackson. I am a workplace and positive psychologist, a coach, a writer, a mum, and apparently a podcaster as of the last 12 months. And I'm really pleased that you are here and listening in to this episode 44 of the podcast. And I wanted to have a little chat right at the front, at the beginning of this episode, about serendipity. And serendipity is defined as the occurrence or development of events by chance in a happy and beneficial way. And the notion of serendipity, this chance, this things just popping up right at the right time when you need them, is not very scientific. Not very scientific at all, but it's something that I think we're drawn to. And in fact, several years ago now, there was a book called The Law of Attraction, which I know gained a lot of popularity. A lot of people read it. And I think my belief, my understanding is that the premise behind it was that if we wish for something enough, it will come to us. Now, that isn't very scientific, and I'm not really sure that it's true, because certainly from a psychological point of view, even though there's not been a whole lot of real research into the notion of serendipity, what we do know is that it's not enough for us to wish something to appear, that we really need to move about. We need to expose ourselves to the situations or the people or the circumstances in which it's more likely that the thing that we're looking for, perhaps that we don't even know that we're looking for yet, appears to us. And beyond moving about, beyond being connected and involved, we need to be open and receptive to the possibility, and we need to be prepared to take action when the opportunities present themselves to us. And that's certainly something that I am really conscious of, and something that I know has helped me enormously in my career and in my various ventures, a preparedness just to say, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I'm going to have a go because an opportunity's presented itself to me. So today's guest and today's episode is very much an example of this. I had a wonderful email from our guest. I didn't know she was going to be our guest at this point in time. She's a listener. She's listened to the podcast, and I had a wonderful email from her saying, I don't normally respond to Facebook or comment on podcasts or blogs or anything like that, but I really felt the need to do so. And she told me about how much she'd enjoyed the podcast and how beneficial she had found it to be, listening to our various experts and the wonderful information and guidance that they give. And so that was, lovely. I love getting feedback like that. It's always a bit of a thrill. And there was something about her phrasing or her tone or what she told me in the brief email that made me go, oh, who is this person? So I followed her, a link through her email back to her website and her blog, and I discovered a little bit more about her and what she does in the world. And you're going to hear more about that shortly. But a blog post that she'd written that I will link to in the show notes for this episode, which is about the well-being effects and how to manage your well-being as an allergy parent, so as the parent of kids with quite significant food allergies. And I read through this and I went, this person is singing our tune. She is really she gets all of the stuff that we talk about on the podcast in terms of well-being and how we can promote it and how we can use simple techniques like mindfulness and meditation and our sleep and our exercise just to keep us on top of things when things get difficult. So I wrote back and I said, I'd love to talk to you on the podcast about all of this. And that is how today's episode came about. She was thrilled. I was thrilled. It was very serendipitous, but it did require me to take some action. And I'm very glad that she also took action and accepted my offer to appear on the show. So let me introduce you to today's guest and our discussion of well-being for allergy parents. My guest today is Callie Mackenzie, and in her pre-child life, Callie was a medical doctor working in a variety of clinical and research roles for nearly 10 years. Once she became a mum, Callie's life changed in ways she might not have imagined at the time, and she became an allergy parent. Today, Callie runs Kid Proof Food, providing education and support for families dealing with food allergies while also juggling family life with 3 children. She's passionate about helping form connections and seeing parents move from feeling overwhelmed to empowered, showing them simple strategies that help give them a shortcut to managing their child's food allergies with greater confidence. And today we're talking about Callie's experiences, what she's learned about managing her own well-being in the midst of the challenges that severe food allergies bring, and her tips for you if you find yourself in a similar place. Welcome, Callie.
Hello, and thank you. That sounds very impressive. I can move up to it.
People are often impressed just by their own bios. It's like, I didn't make any of this up. This is what you do. So, Callie, can you just start by telling us, give us the background? So, I introduced you as having this experience as a medical doctor and working in a clinical field. But then things life always changes when you have children. There's no doubt about that. But you kind of got an extra set of challenges that came along with that.
Yeah, look, I have 3 children, and my 2 oldest actually did have food allergies them as well. But they had what we call non-IgE food allergies. So they had, I think it's commonly known as cow's milk and soy protein intolerance. And so that meant from, my very first child, I was very used to, having to label read and exclude soy and dairy from their diet and my diet when I was breastfeeding. But there was no life-threatening component to it. They just got a bit fussy. They had, bad nappies, and everyone was a bit miserable. But then along came Caleb, and everything kind of very much shifted on its head. So Caleb, all my kids are roughly 2 years apart. And so Caleb and I were home one day. Caleb was sitting on my lap and we were watching his 2-year-old brother playing on the mat in front of us. And Caleb must have squawked or done something. And as a 2-year-old does, my other son ran up and just shoved his finger in Caleb's mouth. And I didn't really think anything of it other than to say we use kind hands. We just kept playing. And then over the next 10 minutes, Caleb got progressively more unsettled. He wouldn't latch on to feed. I couldn't work out why he was crying. And to be honest, I hadn't actually looked at him. I was just watching my son. And I took him upstairs thinking it must be a nappy thing, and I put him down on the change table, and that's when I realised that he was covered in hives. His face had swollen up, his eyes were shut. What I could see of his eyes, he just looked terrified. Mm. And I realised that my son had been eating a peanut butter biscuit, and he had a little bit of peanut butter left on his fingers, and so he'd directly put peanut butter in Caleb's mouth. And at this stage, Caleb was 4.5 months old. He hadn't started solids. This wasn't even on my radar as a thing. So I called my husband, called the ambulance. Cut a long story short, we got taken off. He got treated, stabilised. We were discharged. And because my husband and I are both doctors, we decided to use our phone a friend option, called our beautiful friend who's an immunologist, and she got us in the next week, and she skin pricked him, and it turns out that he was actually allergic to gluten, peanuts, tree nuts, egg, in addition to the dairy and soy that we already knew about. And so for a child who hadn't even started solids, already our feeding and our relationship with food and everything else was disrupted, and it was just this blindside of, everything felt scary, nothing felt safe, and I just felt overwhelmed. Mm. Despite knowing the system, despite being medical, knowing the language, knowing great people to ask for help, I was just, in a spin. And so really that's kind of where it all started.
Okay. And is it unusual? I mean, would it be unusual for a child to be diagnosed with those sorts of allergies at that age? Because, as you say, they're not usually started solids.
Yeah, when we were diagnosed, we were the youngest in the clinic. We were the youngest that they'd ever had. But now when we go for our clinic visits, there's, 2 or 3 bubs of that kind of age. We definitely know that food allergies are on the rise in Australia, and, you hear lots more stories these days of, mums dealing with multiple food allergies from a very young age.
Yeah. Do they know yet why that is?
Oh, there's lots of different theories. Some of it goes to the gut microbiome and, the disruption in how your body learns to recognise food proteins based on what bacteria is in your gut. There's other theories about the age at which various foods are introduced. So there's been a big study that shows if you introduce things like peanuts before the age of 12 months, you've got like an 80% risk reduction in food allergies. Whereas for a very long time, we had a recommendation that you delay introducing those foods. So I think that, there's multiple factors. There's definitely genetic components as well as environmental. There's no one simple fix this and then food allergies will go away. But there's definitely a lot of research going into it, which is really exciting as a food allergy mum.
Yeah. I have a nephew with an anaphylactic peanut allergy. And interesting, so middle child, there is a bit of a family history of things like eczema and asthma, which I believe are linked or could be linked in there somewhere. But he was second child, first child, fine. My sister had no reason to think that any of her, well, like you say, it wasn't even on the radar, particularly because second child and no past history of food allergies. So I think he was about very similar sort of story, but he was a little older. I think he might have been around 2. And exposure to peanut butter and the sudden he went limp, I think, from memory. That's kind of, It's
the longest 10 minutes of your life waiting for that ambulance to come.
Yeah. So, incredibly stressful. He's actually participating in one of the clinical trials. I think it's at the Royal Children's Hospital here in Melbourne at the moment. So I'm very admirable. I have a 10-year-old son as well. They're same age, like within weeks of each other. And he is persevering through this kind of an exposure and I think a probiotic.
Yeah.
Which is tough because he has to put up with just feeling unwell a lot of the time because he's actually being, exposed in a gradual way to peanuts. So, and it's a huge commitment too for family to go through all of that. So that's just one side of it.
Yeah, there's a lot to
it. Yeah. So you talk about feeling overwhelmed, even though, you're a trained medical doctor, you've got expertise, you've got experience, you've got contacts in the field. What were those first months and even years like for you? What were the challenges?
I think initially, just based on my personality more than anything else, my immediate reaction was to get control of what I could control. So I got very organised. I pulled everything out of the pantry. I label read everything. I marked everything safe or unsafe. I became very rigid around, how Caleb's care would unfold. We couldn't go to certain places. We couldn't do certain things. And I think that there's studies that show that your personality definitely impacts the way food allergies play out for you. So for someone like me who has a tendency to be a little neurotic, for me, it was actually, I could gain control and I could feel comfortable with the checking and the rechecking and the rule side of it. But the problem was I was just getting more and more rigid with how I did it and more isolated. Whereas for my husband, who has this really beautiful personality that's open to new experiences, it really chafed much more for him because, we'd gone from being, people who, because, his background is Indian. So we'd go from being people who travel to India or Asia or, very happily to me suddenly saying, can't do it, won't do it. But, partly for good reason. He's a very little child with multiple food allergies and, there's reason behind it. But, I think the first few years were definitely feeling overwhelmed because it's not just the food allergy. So frequently other things run along with it, whether that be, as you mentioned, eczema or asthma. And for us, it was profound fussy eating. So Caleb got to the point where he had complete food refusal. And we were talking about having to admit him to hospital, put NGs down and all this sort of stuff. And so you do feel like you're constantly going from the immunologist to the gastroenterologist to the dietitian to the feeding therapist. And all the time, I just kept coming back to the fact of he was sitting on my lap. and I couldn't keep him safe.
Mm.
You know, like you get quite focused on what's not going well and what's not easy in your life. And I did get sort of trapped in that victimhood of, you know, this is happening to us and this is so hard and I can't keep him safe, or how am I going to grow him up? How am I going to send him to school? Like, and you get very quickly down a rabbit hole feeling like you have no agency in this situation.
Mm. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's something I talk about to lots of people, lots of groups and with coaching clients, is that kind of circle of influence and circle of concern. So the things in life that affect us that we can do nothing about. You could do nothing about the fact that Caleb had these, you know, severe multiple allergies. It was something that...
It's just life.
Yeah, and it feels like it's being done to you if you stay focused in that kind of, this is happening to me and it's not fair, and, you know, which, as you say, is kind of ends up being a very negative and disempowering place to be.
Absolutely. I think because there's so much practicality as well that goes along with food allergies, so there's so much additional work. So, you know, that time where you might otherwise be able to sit down and read something about self-care or do this or do that or help yourself, you're actually in the kitchen baking or doing lunch boxes or, you know, planning 5 steps ahead of, you know, where's he going, who's he going with, who's going to have the EpiPen, who do I need to talk to? Like, so there's just a huge amount of additional work, in addition to the mental load that goes with food allergies that really does contribute, unless you're very conscious about it, getting you stuck and keeping you stuck for quite a period of time. I think often you see your immunologist once or twice a year and they are in a busy clinic because there are so many food allergy kids and no one really ever has the time to say to you, how are you doing, how are you coping? If you are avoiding your allergen, your child is healthy, so you're not frequently at the GP, so the GP doesn't have that opportunity to check in with you and see how you're going. It's very hard for non-food allergy parents to understand what you're going through, so you can find very quickly that you don't have a sounding board really to fact check, to see whether your concerns are valid or how someone else dealing with it, what tips or tricks, you know, like it's a very strange sort of situation to find yourself in, I think. Because your natural reaction is to retreat from that social connection because, you know, you're trying to keep your child safe. But really that's when you should be stepping forward and reaching out, and that has been one of the biggest things that I've noticed has been shifting with this whole online world and, you know, social media and that sort of thing. That's a really big difference to when we were very first diagnosed.
Yeah, because things have changed quite considerably. So
just 3 years.
Yeah, I know. It's nuts. So at that stage, say, you know, those early months, so at this stage you've got an infant, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old or thereabouts. So, I mean, just even that itself sounds overwhelming to me. Without having, so you've got that, you've got, as you say, the mental load, that constant kind of thinking, checking, worrying, anticipating, planning, plus the practicalities of food preparation and managing that, plus then the social isolation. So I think that's really interesting, and we'll talk a little later about, you know, the things that you have found have helped you in terms of your well-being. But that social isolation, and I'm wondering whether is that, I can see that, you know, you withdrawing because it's too hard to do play dates, it's too hard to go to cafes, it's too hard to engage in those kind of everyday things that other people would take for granted. Did you find that you were met with resistance from other people who perhaps didn't understand or almost kind of resented that you were somehow trying to make things more complicated?
100%, absolutely. And I think unless you've seen a reaction, it's really difficult to explain what it is and how it feels, and just that gut-wrenching nausea watching your child suffer. I think there's a lot of fad diets, there's a lot of, you know, trendy exclusion practices that, you know, people kind of think you're jumping on a bandwagon or they don't understand the severity or why you're doing it. And part of our role as food allergy parents is educating other people and advocating for our child, but it does get exhausting. Sometimes you just want people to get it. I've been really lucky from a family perspective, but that is another huge issue for a lot of people, is family understanding and expectation, especially older generations where this just wasn't a thing when they were bringing their kids up, and they don't understand it. And often grandparents, like to show their love with treats or feeding, or, however they, often it centres around food. And so if you throw a restriction, or you tell them, no, you're not doing it right, or you can't do it, or, all those sorts of things, it certainly does fracture those relationships as well. And even within relationships, if, each partner has a different expectation or as to how this should go. So it's definitely the friends and the wider community. Going into a cafe and having to persevere through every single ingredient that Caleb can't have. Sometimes it's easier just to say what is in it as opposed to what's not.
Yeah.
And even then, the other day I phoned a restaurant and sort of started trying to go through it, and I just got shut down and hung up on. And you just sort of think, I can see your perspective, but it doesn't help people when they're already feeling fragile and tired and overwhelmed. Be met with that.
That sort of resistance. Yeah, and it's interesting actually what you said about, until you've seen a child have a reaction, because I think even for me it was when I think the boys might have been, I don't know, maybe 4 something. Yeah, they would have been 4 because my youngest was a baby, and we took all the kids, so this is me and my sister and my parents, took the grandchildren out to Wildlife Park, and no, it didn't occur to anybody, but my nephew had the kangaroo food, the little pellets that they give you to hold out and feed the kangaroos, and that was fine. But then we suddenly realised, and I think I'd taken my little guy off to change his nappy in the change rooms, and my sister comes screaming through the door holding Max, and the whole of the side of his face is just... And I actually took a photo of it because I couldn't believe how extreme, his eye had disappeared. It was just, he hadn't eaten it. We think what's happened, there's lupin or something in the food, the animal food, and he's just rubbed his eye. And yeah, the whole of the site, he'd had that diagnosis of the allergy for a couple of years by that stage. But I didn't appreciate, even as his aunt, just how severe this thing was, that something he didn't even ingest had basically, just his face looked like a swollen balloon on one side.
And if you think of that in their airway and how...
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's very hard to comprehend, I think. And so I think you're met with a lot of disbelief or minimising, or it's hard. It's hard for people to understand sometimes, I think.
Yeah. So there's really an education component, and you've taken that a step further, which we'll talk about shortly. But even just in everyday life, a level of education, perhaps of people who don't always want to be educated.
Absolutely. And that's the other thing. You have to be incredibly careful with how you do it. But I guess if you just keep in mind that the ultimate goal is for your child to be included and, feel just as much a part of things as any other child. You can take everything with a grain of salt if you're doing it for someone else, really, can't you?
Yeah, it does change your perspective, absolutely, part of the role of a parent. It's interesting what you said too about the personality. I have a background in personality psychology, it's one of my favourite topics. So, and the fact that different personalities will respond to situations like these, experiences like this, differently.
Yeah. I showed my husband and he's like, see, this is...
this is a thing.
This is a thing.
So for you, it was about trying to control, which makes logical sense. And I can imagine for a lot of people it would be that, okay, the only way I can deal with this uncertainty, this level of threat in my life to my child, and therefore to some extent to myself, is to try and tightly control that, to manage it and keep
Absolutely.
it.
And I think unlike other chronic medical, not like all chronic medical conditions, but, food allergy is a chronic medical condition that the only intervention at this stage widely available outside clinical trials is avoidance and carry care. That's a lot of responsibility. Like, the entire intervention is essentially on the primary caregiver, because they also have to educate everyone who's then going to subsequently take on the child. So there's a lot riding on it.
And so some people will, and I can imagine, I'm wondering whether even within that community of allergy parents, people would respond differently due to their personality or due to their previous experience. But certainly personality would, there will be people who feel very anxious, very worried, try to tightly control things. Other people, as you say, your husband, more relaxed, perhaps from a day-to-day perspective, but then resentments and challenges pop up elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it definitely, some people will experience more grief as to what they've lost. Other people will be anxious about what the future might bring. My husband, I mentioned I was doing this interview and I said, what's been your experience? And he said the hardest thing for him was the changes to my diet, not the kids, not dealing with anything there, but just the fact that even when we went out for dinner, it was omnipresent because I couldn't eat soy, milk and eggs.
Mm-hmm.
That crosses, when I was breastfeeding. And, for him it changes even the way he and I relate on a social thing. And it's just like, that hadn't even registered in my top 10.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? To get that other person's perspective and to find out that there's things that upset or irritate or frustrate that are not on your radar and probably vice versa.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting, so interesting. So in terms of, I know there's a bit of research now into the mental health and wellbeing challenges for is allergy parent an okay term? I'm using that term.
Absolutely.
It's an okay term, good. What do we know from a scientific perspective around mental health challenges?
There's been quite a bit of research. We know from the kids' perspective that they probably have quality of life scores on par with children who have type 1 diabetes. So they certainly have separation anxiety, which kind of makes sense if you're separated from your parent. So they've got separation anxiety. They have higher scores for coping in an anxious manner, so that hypervigilance around food and restrictions around that. In that slightly older age group, so the 10 to 16 sort of adolescent kids who have come through with this longer period of restrictions, they also have the separation anxiety and depression, but there is sort of a link with some of the more restrictive disordered eating. And so that is sort of another sort of emerging thing. Children who have multiple episodes of anaphylaxis can experience post-traumatic stress kind of symptoms, as can their parents. And then for the kids in particular, we know that there is a higher rate of bullying of kids with food allergy. So depending on the study, 25 to 45% of children with a food allergy will experience teasing or bullying related to their food allergy. And that might just be a resentment about the fact that you can't bring cupcakes into class to celebrate birthdays, or to the extreme that we've seen sort of in the UK and the US of people being force-fed or taunted with their allergen. For parents, it shows particularly mothers more so than fathers, and I guess that's more a primary caregiver. It wasn't specified whether it was sort of heteronormative couples, that, their experience is harder. They have higher rates of anxiety and depression on some studies. Others don't show that, but they definitely do show that they're living with high levels of stress and distress and lower quality of life than their non-allergic parental peers. And I mean, it definitely has been my experience in terms of speaking to other parents that even if they don't meet a criteria, for a clear diagnosis of anxiety or depression, they certainly don't feel like they're living their best life, so to speak.
Yeah. What in positive psychology we call languishing. So there's kind of, if you look at the full spectrum there, there's people who, and I'm doing hand signals here of normal curves that nobody else can see, but perhaps I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But, we have a certain segment of the population who have a clinically diagnosable level of distress. Then we have a certain segment of the population who we just call languishing. So it's not quite, it's not even good mental health. It's just, struggling, not thriving and flourishing, which is what we aim for at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's a bit like, you look at chronic pain, I guess, like you can't take the pain away, but you can change your experience of the suffering. I think that's a similar idea. Like you can't take the food allergy away, but the suffering aspect of it doesn't have to stay.
So how did you start to uncover that and move from that kind of perhaps, if not clinical distress, to the languishing through to thriving at the other end? How have you managed to start to change that mindset or that level of suffering?
It's been a slow process. Even before Caleb came along, I'd been, I guess, once again, it's a personality thing. And, being a doctor, I wanted to do parenting the right way. I now know that is just another rigid thought and there is just ways. But at the time, it did lead me into some good reading. And one of the things I found was Brené Brown. And I was listening to a talk she was giving on imperfect parenting. And in the beginning of that, she said, we can't give our children what we don't have ourselves. And that was just a light bulb going on for me, because I just thought, you know what, I don't want my kids growing up anxious or worried or feeling uncomfortable in this world. I want them to go out there and grab the world by its throat and live a happy life. And so it kind of really compelled me to find better ways of, because even before Caleb came along, obviously with two very young kids close together, it is not easy. So, I didn't want them to grow up with this kind of heaviness.
Yep.
And so, I'd sort of started reading things and dipping my toe into reading about mindfulness and, all sorts of things and values, but it was all very cerebral.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometime around my 39th, 40th kind of year, I was sitting in the kitchen with one of my mates who just finished a PhD, and she said, oh, man, just submitted, self-care really dipped off these last few months. But, the last 2 weeks I've hit the yoga mat, I'm back into mindfulness, I'm feeling great. And I was just floored. Like, I really honestly had this concept that self-care was selfish. It was a luxury. It was something that people who were weak did. Like, I had this real resistance to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could read about it and I would cerebrally go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I can understand about the amygdala and this and that. But it wasn't something I was doing.
Yeah.
And
or that you felt you could do.
But I could do.
That you had permission to do.
Yeah. And that one comment was enough to make me go, oh, I really respect this woman. She's amazing. I adore her, and she does this. And so very, very slowly, and initially, once again, I was quite rigid with it because I wanted it to be a habit.
Mm-hmm.
So
you wanted to do it right.
Yeah, I had to, so I did my meditation every day. I did my yoga every day. And, I did that for a good 4 months, and the change was phenomenal. It was the stuff that got me well.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also then allowed me to become more flexible with how I approached the stuff that then would come on to make me happy. So, the things that made me well were, sleep. Getting enough sleep with young kids is never easy, but actually not telling myself that story of I have to sit up till 11 o'clock after everyone's in bed and my husband's gone to bed just so I can have an hour of me time.
Mm-hmm.
But then I wake up at 6 a.m. and I'm exhausted and grumpy, and so maybe that hour would be better used sleeping. So, finding ways to build in more sleep, eat better, because, I was the mum that ate the crusts off everyone else's pizza.
That was your dinner.
Yeah. And so kind of really making a conscious effort not to be that martyr anymore, not to, subjugate my needs to everybody else's, to actually say, you know what, me being well is, above and beyond the biggest gift I can give you guys. Because if I can't figure it out, how on earth am I going to help you?
Mm.
And so October 2017, I went back to uni. It was a business degree. It was nothing medical. It was just, something I wanted to do because I was helping out with the books in my husband's practice. And honestly, it was the driest subject in the world that started. Like, it was accounting, and then it was, something else. But it was just like a light had gone back on. I was using my brain. I was doing group work. There was a lot of group work. One of my subjects was quite, I guess it's the psychology of the workplace. So there was a lot of reading material that was just fantastic for me and for where I was at the time. And so, building on that, I then really started to look at skills and strengths, and I uncovered Kristen Neff. And that for me was life-changing. So I'd heard of self-care. Obviously, I don't think you could live anywhere other than under a rock this day and age to not hear about self-care.
True, although a lot of it still is about bubble baths and reading magazines and things. There was
an article in the Sydney Morning Herald on the weekend about how wellbeing is turning us all into narcissists because we're all so busy looking inwards that we forget to. And it's just like, no, it's the opposite.
Not how it works.
It's not the green smoothie and the sculpted butt cheeks.
Yep. So much more than that.
But yeah, this idea of self-compassion was the missing piece for me. I was the stereotypical female doctor who went straight into med school out of high school. I did everything I was meant to do. I was fast-tracked to a specialty training. And I was never very kind to myself. There was high expectations. There was no prizes for not meeting those expectations kind of thing. And, I could be incredibly compassionate to my patients and my friends and everyone else around me, but I didn't give that to myself.
Mm.
And I think my daughter she's 7 now. She had extreme anxiety when she started kindy. And so we were seeing a psychologist with her, and just the lessons, hearing how she was being taught to speak to herself and to look after herself and give herself kindness and understanding, and understand that there's not a right and a wrong way of doing things. There's just ways, and some are helpful and some aren't. And learning about feelings and, you know, all of this sort of stuff, like, it was honestly life-changing for me as well as for her. And so bringing in all of that idea of the self-compassion and being able to reach for that in the moment rather than having to wait till I was off the clock and I could, you know, jump in the bath or whatever it might be. You know, something where I could reach for the moment and go, this is going to pot. I'm not doing a great job, but that's okay. I'm trying. And being able to, you know, sit with that and just soothe myself in that moment, to pick myself up and keep going. And then the mindfulness, so that, you know, that practice of calming my very overactive brain. So I do tend to be a ruminator. So having the tools to note it and just go, oh, well, I'm not going to buy into that. I'm not going to over-identify with that. I'm just going to let that go. And the awareness side of the mindfulness practice, so I can feel now, oh, you're getting a bit anxious about this situation. Where are you feeling it? What does it look like? Where is it sitting in your body? Okay, let's just... So, you know, using those tools that mean that now I can have a difficult conversation with the restaurant, or I can, you know, have a situation where I get a last-minute phone call saying, come in for a food challenge tomorrow. And, you know, you're all the feels of, oh, my God, I've got this ingredient that we've never had in our house. Now I have to get him to eat it tomorrow. Oh, my God, what's going to happen? Are they going to be able to deal with it if something goes wrong? And I can just go, oh, I'm just feeling a bit anxious about that. That's okay. And so, you know, it's these tools, and, you know, I'm coming from a better place because I've slept well, I've eaten, I've gone for my run, depending which child I drop off last. It's either around Centennial Park or it's running along the beach. So I am so much more, you know, set up to be well. And then I have these additional practices that just help me feel happy, that mean that my experience of living with food allergy and the stresses of that, and the stresses of parenting 2 other kids with, you know, multiple needs, and a husband who's incredibly busy, and, you know, all those things, throw in the 2 dogs for good measure. Like, it's just, it really has changed the way we as a family function. And it's certainly bringing those little moments of joy and connection much more frequently, and me being able to relax and be flexible rather than this rampant rigidity certainly lets the kids relax. Yeah. Because kids need boundaries, absolutely, but they don't need needless rules. So when you can soften and say yes, you know, being able to give them that gift has been huge.
That was me yesterday morning as I left them at home still in their pyjamas on their screens, because it was the first day of school holidays here. We started school holidays. And it was that kind of, oh, my God, this is bad. They shouldn't be doing this. This should be finding activities for them. And then the part of me that went, well, you know what, I've got to go to work, and I could nag my husband to do something about it because he was home with them, or I could just go, you know what, I don't think it really matters. It's the first day of holidays. Let's just let this go. They're having a great time. I'm not going to be there to see it. Husband doesn't really care. Let it go.
Not their lifestyle. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is that, particularly for allergy siblings, they often suffer alongside. And that's, so my change has probably had a much bigger impact on them than it has on Caleb. I mean, Caleb will reap the benefits when he's older. But for Annabelle and Ethan, you know, me finding ways for them to still experience, like that, you know, scrambled eggs is one of their favourite foods, or, you know, boiled eggs with toast fingers. And for a really long time, I just wouldn't do it.
Yep, it's too hard.
Too hard. Whereas now I'm just like, you guys really love it. And I'm actually just saying no because I can say no because I'm the mum. So, you know, let's try and make this work. How can we do this? And so sometimes I'll do it at home, and the other times Annabelle and I will go and sit in the cafe together and make that time and make that moment. And I won't be the mum that's always saying no. You know, I won't be the mum that's always meeting with resistance. It's those little moments that bring you the happiness that just make you realise that, you know, this is what I'm doing all of this for.
Yeah, it's so interesting, all of that combination of the way we think and perceive a situation, the way we then manage our thoughts around that, all of that permission giving that we really need to get to in order to be able to enact all of this. And I think, unfortunately, the term self-care, and you may have listened to, I interviewed Susie Redding, who has a book called The Self-Care Revolution. So she talks about this and her own experience of actually having to get to kind of rock bottom, just feeling completely burnt out and overwhelmed as a parent and as a family member, as a partner, in response to circumstances that she had no control over, and realising that she had to kind of build herself back up from that. And this idea that self-care is not about the bubble baths or the, you know, what you might term more frivolous things, although if you like a bubble bath and it's good self-care, go for it.
Yeah.
But that it is about, sometimes it's about, well, a lot of the time it's about sleep, and it's about exercise, and it's about having, for some people, structure and routine that they didn't have, or for other people, letting go of some of the structure and rigidity, as you mentioned, that they do have. And it's actually about, at its core, allowing you to be happy and your best self and thrive and flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can't really do food allergies without a degree of rigidity and without a degree of structure. But I think once you've got that set up, you rest on that to then build on the other stuff. And, you know, that's been the way for us. So, you know, yeah, my pantry is still military precision organised, and lunchboxes still happen. And yes, I still go in and I talk to the preschool about, you know, safe and unsafe, and I'm still there and I'm still doing all those things that need to be done to keep him safe. You know, I haven't let that go, but I'm doing it with a different set point, I guess.
Through a different lens.
Yeah, and it is. It's all about the reframe, and it's all about taking responsibility and getting conscious and saying, this situation isn't working for me, but it's on me to change it. And yes, you know, my mate Jane giving me that permission in a way to not see it as weak or, you know, indulgent or selfish or anything else. But yeah, it's about taking responsibility and saying it's actually on me to change this, because no one else is going to do it for me, because no one else knows the best way to do it for me.
Yeah, it's a very personal experience. So, Callie, you help others through your experience and your knowledge and your medical background, I'm guessing, to some extent as well, or at least being immersed in that side of things. You help other parents who are perhaps finding themselves in a position of just being diagnosed or are dealing with the overwhelm. If there's someone listening who's at that point where they're really just feeling like they're drowning in all of this and they're struggling, and you had something you could tell them to shift them away from that, what would that be?
I think the first thing is to just acknowledge to yourself, this is hard. This is hard. It's not what I expected. It's not what I would have chosen for my child. It is hard, but I also do need to find a way through this. So it is that it's accepting and acknowledging and validating your feelings, because you may not get that validation anywhere else. So you've got to give it to yourself. But then you also have to say, you know what, I have a way, I need to find a way through this. I would say with food allergies, it's always much easier to feel in control and comfortable when you have a degree of order around how you're going to do food. So whether that be organising your pantry in a certain way, whether that be, you know, meal planning, whether that be going to the supermarket with our kids and, you know, reading labels.
Having the time.
That you get up. Yeah. And so finding ways that the practicalities of food allergies can be attended to. Because if you're constantly having to read a label every single time you're reaching for a snack, or trusting that the babysitter will remember to read that label, or whatever it is, that's just going to go over and over in your mind in the background. And so, you know, it's always just going to increase your anxiety levels. And then I would say just acknowledge that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And you do need to find ways that are going to help you manage that. So whether that be, you know, for me, I don't think I could do this without the sleep, eating, exercise piece, and then the meditation and yoga has been huge for me. But then the social connection, as much as you want to retreat and stay safe, even if in the short term, you know, your social connection might be an online one, find like-minded people who get it and can support you. And, you know, if they're 10 steps further ahead on the allergy journey to guide you, reach out for that help. You don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself. It's been invented, it's been refined, it's there ready to go. Reach for that. And then really just understand that food allergy is a constantly changing landscape. So it may be that your child is going through a different developmental stage. It may be that their allergies are changing and they're growing out of things. It may be all of those things. And so if you can maintain a degree of flexibility, help your child through that kind of thing, it certainly will make your allergy journey much easier.
And one of the things, just as you're saying that final piece about, the landscape always changing, I guess too from a research and from a medical point of view, the landscape is changing as well, that there is, as you said right at the beginning, a huge amount of work being done, which is wonderful. And so I'm guessing that even just staying in regular contact with your immunologist or GP or the expert.
Absolutely. So particularly you have very young children, you should be going at least once a year. When we saw our immunologist last year, she was hopeful that when we go back this time, Caleb might be able to start peanut patches.
Okay.
There's new things coming all the time. And as your child ages, they're likely to tip over into an age group that might be able to enrol in a trial. There's lots of different things that change. They might grow out of their food allergy. And that's a whole other thing to get your head around once you've been so rigid about. You can't have this, all of a sudden you have to find ways to introduce it and get your child confident to eat it.
Yes, the confidence and trust, I can imagine, for you and for the child would be an element there.
Yeah, so I think it's a huge shift, and there's so many different aspects to it that you would probably never anticipate until you've lived it and walked it. So just be kind to yourself in the journey more than anything.
Which is wonderful advice, I think, probably for most of our lives, whether we're allergy parents or anybody else, that self-compassion and being kind and accepting that we are all human and that humans find things hard and sometimes we make mistakes and we can't control everything that we'd like to be able to control, and that's okay.
That is okay. Yeah.
Callie, where can people find out more about you and other particular? I know we've mentioned Kristen Neff and Brené Brown. Brené Brown comes up a lot with my podcast guests. She's an amazing lady. So, and I'll put links to their work in the show notes. They can find you at kidprooffood.com.au. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. Look, I think for food allergy specific things, the Australian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy is called ASCIA, and they have a website that's got lots of very factual information. So, if you do want a cheat sheet on nut allergy and, that sort of stuff, that's a really good place to go. The podcasts that I found really helpful in terms of almost like that permission piece for self-care and the mindfulness meditation. There's a lady called Amy Taylor-Kabaz who runs Happy Mama, and I've really enjoyed listening to her podcasts. She has a very kind approach to parenting and mothering. And she also does these beautiful meditations for kids called Bedtime Explorers, which have been fantastic for our anxious kids.
Yep.
And they're just little guided meditations that let them drift off to sleep in a really beautiful way. So if your child, because often allergy kids do have anxieties, it's a really nice way to reset at the end of the day. If you are a social media person, pop on and see if you can find like-minded people in the food allergy space. It's been an incredibly eye-opening thing for me. I was so resistant to Instagram. I had no idea how it worked, what it was. It wasn't for me. I'm too old. And that has been incredible. Like I posted the other day that we were going for a food challenge. I got lots of well wishes, but then I also got other people coming back in a day later to check in and see how it had gone. These are the mamas who have been there, who've done it, who understand those mixed emotions and feelings. And, they do hold space for you to share your trials and tribulations and lots of factual information. One account that I would suggest is called Land of Can, and that's by a young guy. His name's JJ, and he's American, but he grew up with a nut and dairy allergy, and he's now in his early 20s. So his perspective is entirely of a child. So I'm coming at it from a mum, but his perspective is, this is my lived experience as a child growing up with these food allergies. He does a weekly interview with his mum and dad and chat about the challenges they experienced. But yeah, it's just his lived experience, and he does this little diary almost of, conversations with his allergy, or this happened to me as a kid, how would you tell your child to deal with it? So to sort of forecast challenges that might come up and how I might want to go about it, and pitfalls to avoid kind of thing. I found it a really interesting account.
So that was Land of
Can. As opposed to cannot, you can.
Land of Can. Okay, that makes sense. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, so that's probably my main ones, I'd say.
Yeah, wonderful. And at Kid Proof Food, you offer, so you've got guidance there for cooking and strategies around, what are the other things that you cover? I know I've looked at it, but from your perspective.
Look, a lot of it at the moment, I'm still in that development phase. So we're fleshing out a membership that's going to be based on like a 6-step, Thrive with Allergies. We'll be getting guest experts in to do interviews and, looking at, foundations of food allergies and then how to thrive and then beyond. But really at the moment on the website and on my social media, it's a lot about sharing food. It's the co-allergic conditions, so the fussy eating, how you might, address some of those issues, looking at some of these trickier things like relationships with families, self-care, well-being, deep diving on random allergy ingredients you may never have heard of, and just really trying to have that conversation to normalise the difficulties of allergies, but to remind people that they don't have to stay stuck there, that there are, better ways of doing things for yourself.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that triggered our conversation from my perspective was a blog post that you wrote early, I think it was at the beginning of last month, beginning of March, which is called The Art of Wellbeing as an Allergy Parent. So a lot of the things that we've talked about today are really beautifully written in that blog post. So I'll link directly to that, but people can find all of your blog posts and the other pieces that you've just talked about all there on the website and through your social media account. And we can all look forward to seeing that unfold as it becomes, a wonderful resource.
Yeah, it's exciting days.
Very exciting. Callie, it's been so lovely speaking to you. It's given me some different things to think about as even as an allergy aunt, if that's a thing. But also just, it's so wonderful to see all of those things that we talk about so much on the podcast, those elements of self-care, the mindfulness, the thinking skills, the sleep and the food and all of these components that we know help everybody to thrive and flourish, and to see how beautifully that has worked for you in the context of these particular challenges that you and your family face.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can give someone a shortcut through that feeling by sharing my experiences, it is 100% worth it.
And I have no doubt that you have done that already as people have listened in. So thank you again, and people can find out more at kidprooffood.com.au.
Thanks so much, Ellen.
Thank you so much for joining me for this great conversation with Callie Mackenzie about the wellbeing of allergy parents. And if you're interested in learning more about Callie and Kid Proof Food, her online resource designed to help kids and families deal with allergies to live whole and happy lives, you'll find a link to her website and her social media profiles in the show notes for this episode. There, you'll also find our downloadable guest profile for Callie and Kid Proof Food, including Callie's fantastic tips for helping yourself and your family thriving as an allergy parent. Her tips include taking the time to acknowledge your emotions, getting practical at home and out and about, calling on your support networks, remembering not to reinvent the wheel, and the superpower of flexibility. And Callie gives great detail on each of these, so please do check these out at potential.com.au/podcast. And a new feature in our show notes that we've started this season is a full transcript for each episode. So if you like to read as well as listen, or there was detail in this episode that you'd like to revisit, you can download the full transcript in the show notes as well. So head to potential.com.au/podcast. While you're there, you might also like to sign up to our newsletter to get the latest news on upcoming guests, links to associated articles, some behind-the-scenes detail from here at Potential HQ, including our upcoming trip to Sydney to celebrate the Australian Podcast Awards and to find out how we fare as one of 6 finalists in the Best New Podcaster Award category. You'll find a link to subscribe on the website at potential.com.au. So what do we have coming up for you next week? Well, it's the perfect episode for music lovers, and really, that's all of us, isn't it? I'm talking to Dr. Sandra Garrido, who's a pianist, a violinist, a psychologist and a researcher into the effects of music on our mood. And we talk about why music moves us, what we know about why and how music has emerged from traditional cultures through to today, how our relationship with music has changed, and how we can use music strategically to enhance our mood, our productivity, and our well-being. So here's Sandra to tell us a little bit more.
We have this thing called entrainment, which is something that mostly only humans have. Primates certainly don't have it. And that's that thing where when we hear a rhythmical beat, we can't help but tap our foot or nod our head or whatever. We just start to synchronize with the beat. And you don't need musical training to do that. That means that even when you're what we might call passively consuming music, you're actually not passive. You're actually getting involved. And so where's the line between somebody who's drumming their fingers on the steering wheel while they're listening to music and somebody who's had a bit of training and is drumming on a proper drum kit? As far as I'm concerned, it's all creative and it's all active involvement in music. So even when we're consuming music that is produced by somebody else, our natural tendency is to get involved in that and to co-create, even in a small way.
That's next week in episode 45 of the Potential Psychology podcast. As always, thanks so much for listening. Let me know what you've enjoyed today. I'd love to hear from you. You can drop me a line at any time at ellenjackson@potential.com.au or via our Facebook page or our Instagram profile. So have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.